Ever feel like relationships these days, they're like way more complicated than they used to be?
Right.
We all want that rock solid connection. But figuring out how to actually get there, well, it can be tough.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like, where's the instruction manual for this thing, right?
Right.
So today, we are diving deep, just for you, into some really incredible material, all about building a truly effective marriage or partnership.
We're going way beyond those surface level tips.
Oh, yeah.
We're digging into the core principles for a more fulfilling and lasting relationship.
Exactly.
We'll be drawing directly from The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Marriage by Sandra Covey.
And one thing that's so important to remember is that this isn't just about one type of relationship.
Right.
These ideas, they apply to any two adults, no matter what their legal status is or how their family is structured.
Absolutely. In fact, the preface of the book actually references a concept from Hardwired to Connect, which highlights that deep human need for connection.
It's like wired into us.
It really is.
So think of it this way. Your relationship is like an airplane.
Okay.
To reach that destination, that happy and lasting partnership, you need to know where you're going, have a solid flight plan, and trust those instruments.
I like that.
And that's what the 7 habits are.
Yeah.
Your flight plan for your relationship.
Makes sense. So let's get started with part 1 of the book, which dives into the interaction within the relationship, building a solid foundation. It's all about these 7 habits of a high-performance marriage.
And the author's wife, Sandra, really kicks it off with some really insightful personal reflections.
Oh, yeah.
She talks about how it's almost surprising that any partnership really thrives, given how different all of our backgrounds are.
Yeah.
Every family has their own unique ways of doing things.
It's true.
And Sandra contrasts her own upbringing. She describes it as very open and expressive, lots of physical affection.
Okay.
With Stephen's family, which was like more private,
Right.
more reserved.
Yeah.
And even the way they communicate was different. She often wanted him to talk more, while he sometimes wished she would talk less.
I bet a lot of our listeners can relate to that.
Oh, for sure. But they had to figure out how to navigate those differences.
Right.
And one thing they focused on was using each other's strengths.
Okay.
Sandra shares that, initially, her mother was actually a little anxious about Stephen's more adventurous nature.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, they made a conscious decision
Okay.
to prioritize what was best for their children while still respecting each other's styles.
That's so important, that conscious choice.
Exactly.
To navigate those differences
Yeah.
instead of trying to make everything the same.
Absolutely. And a great example she gives is her love for the arts,
Okay.
which is quite different from Stephen's passion for sports.
Yeah.
They made an effort to find that balance,
Right.
to support each other's interests.
Yeah.
There's even a little story about their sons who weren't always thrilled about attending cultural events.
Oh, that sounds familiar.
Right. But as they got older, they actually sought out those experiences. They even thought it was cool to share those experiences with dates.
Oh, I love that. It shows how appreciation can really grow with time and with that intentional effort.
And a key takeaway here is, as a couple, you have the power to choose how you want to do things.
Yeah.
You don't just have to follow the patterns you grew up with. You can create your own unique traditions, your own ways of being together.
And this really transitions nicely into the importance of communication. Sandra even has a section called Empathetic Communication is Key.
Oh, yeah.
She talks about, how Stephen would call her frequently when he was traveling, even at odd hours because of time zone differences, just to check in.
That's so important, making that effort to stay connected, even when it's not convenient.
It really is.
And I love their little ritual of riding their Honda scooters together.
Oh, so that's nice.
Like dedicated time, away from distractions, just the two of them talking and connecting.
Yeah, it's about creating those intentional spaces for communication,
They
no
seem-
matter how simple they might seem.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sandra also emphasizes how important it is to feel safe enough to express your concerns openly to your partner.
Right.
And she quotes Stephen here. He says, "Unexpressed feelings never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways."
Wow. Powerful.
It's a reminder that avoiding those tough conversations can actually lead to bigger issues.
Yeah, makes sense.
And then there's that bit of humor she includes, which I love. The story about David O. McKay's wife, who, when asked if she ever considered divorce after 60 years of marriage, said, "Didn't think about divorce, thought about murder."
Oh, that's funny.
It's like a way to acknowledge that even the strongest relationships have their moments.
It's true.
It's okay to have those.
Exactly, normalizes it a bit.
Yeah.
They also have a section about appreciating each other's differences.
Oh, yes.
And I really liked their communication method, the honesty scale.
Tell me more about that.
So they would each rate how much they wanted to do something on a scale of 1 to 10.
Okay.
So let's say one person wanted to go to the opera. The other one wanted to go to a basketball game.
Right.
They would be completely honest.
Okay.
No exaggerating.
So really understanding how important it was to the other person.
Exactly. And that often led to the person who really wanted to do something getting their way.
I love that.
Because not all desires are created equal.
That's a great tool. I also got a chuckle out of the sign Sandra put in their bathroom. I loved you more yesterday. Yesterday, you really got on my nerves.
That's funny.
You know, it's just acknowledging those daily ups and downs of, sharing a life.
It keeps things real.
It does.
They also have a section called Opening Your Heart.
Uh-huh.
Their family tradition of applauding for meals and giving a touchdown cheer for a really good dinner, it's just heartwarming.
It is.
And they have this, hey, hooray, cheer for accomplishments.
Oh, I like that.
Big or small.
It's just creating that positive atmosphere
Exactly.
of support.
And then they tell this story about their friends, Anne and Truman. It highlights that sometimes love isn't always expressed in the ways we expect, or even in words.
Oh, interesting.
Sometimes it's about recognizing those different love languages.
That's so key. We all give and receive love in different ways.
We do.
And then they talk about expressing love and happiness more broadly,
Okay.
talking about their tradition of making a big fuss over guests.
Oh, nice.
Or Sandra's mother dressing up for her father when he came home.
Oh.
And their elaborate birthday and holiday celebrations.
It's about that intentionality.
Yes. It's not just going through the motions.
Right.
It's about really putting that effort in.
It makes people feel special.
Exactly. And of course, what's a good relationship without a little laughter?
It's true.
So they move on to good relationships need humor, and the story about Stephen accidentally leaving Sandra on the side of the highway in Montana after church.
Oh,
It's just classic. Her patience, his obliviousness, the highway patrol's reaction. It's all so funny. But the takeaway is that being able to laugh together, especially during those kind of unexpected moments, is so important.
It's essential.
It helps you not take things too seriously. Now that brings us to a bit of a shift in focus. So far we've heard mostly Sandra's experiences, but now the book transitions to achieving personal success through 3 habits, as seen through Stephen's perspective.
Okay.
This is where we start to lay the groundwork for individual effectiveness as a foundation for a strong relationship.
Makes sense.
And it all begins with a quote that Stephen came across during a research sabbatical in Hawaii. He says, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom."
That's powerful.
And he talks about how that realization had such a profound impact on him and really became the basis for the 7 habits. It's that moment, that pause, where we have a choice. And then he brings in Eleanor Roosevelt's famous quote, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent,"
Oh, yes.
to really emphasize this idea that we have agency in how we respond. It's not just about what happens to us. It's about how we choose to feel and react.
Yeah, taking responsibility
Exactly.
for our own emotions.
Yeah. And what I find really insightful is how he contrasts our typical reactions to negative things,
Uh-huh.
like, either expressing anger or suppressing it.
Right.
But he says there's a third option, transcending those emotions. He argues that even feeling offended is a choice we make.
Interesting.
We have the ability to transform those emotions by staying true to our deepest values.
That's a powerful idea. We can manage our emotions instead of being controlled by them.
Exactly. And he points out that, the choices we make in that seemingly small space, they have a ripple effect.
Oh, yeah.
It affects our relationships with our partners, our kids, everyone. Every time we choose a thoughtful response over a knee-jerk reaction, we're building stronger connections.
It's those little moments that add up.
Exactly.
And that leads right into his idea of don't forget we have the power to choose, which is connected to habit 1, be proactive.
Okay.
He explains that exercising that power actually expands our space for freedom. But when we neglect it, we shrink that space, making us feel more like victims.
It's like we're giving away our power.
Exactly. He even contrasts human choice with, how animals react. They just operate on instinct. But humans have this self-awareness. We can think about our own thinking.
Right.
And that allows us to reinvent ourselves, to rewrite our story.
It's empowering.
It is. And there's this great piece of advice from Brent Barlow. To improve your marriage, look in the mirror. It's such a simple reminder to focus on our own responsibility.
Absolutely. It's not about blaming our partner.
Yeah.
It's about looking at our own contributions to the dynamic.
And by choosing our reactions, we break those negative cycles.
Right.
And we can start to find those third alternatives in conflict, moving beyond just those initial positions,
Yes, finding creative solutions instead of just giving in or compromising.
Exactly. And that proactive foundation leads to what he calls creating powerful visions for the future.
Okay.
And this is where he introduces imagination and conscience as key elements of habit 2. Begin with the end in mind.
So how do those two work together?
Well, imagination allows us to break free from the past. It's like our memories and experiences don't have to define us. We can envision what we want. And conscience provides that inner sense of right and wrong, that compass.
Our moral guide.
Yeah.
So by combining those, we can define the future we desire, both for ourselves and for our relationship.
Exactly. We can rise above those patterns we inherited from our families.
And he really emphasizes that a lot of the problems we face actually stem from that family history.
Uh-huh.
He even uses the term cultural genes.
Oh, interesting.
Those ingrained ways of thinking about relationships that we unconsciously pick up.
From our families and society.
Exactly.
So it's like those beliefs are passed down.
Yeah. He also talks about how divorce is so accepted these days.
Right.
And how we can sometimes rationalize it, telling ourselves these believable lies to justify what we want.
It's about having that strong inner compass, that moral guide.
Exactly.
Not just following the trends.
Right. And he tells this really interesting story from a young president's organization workshop
Okay.
where they were trying to write family mission statements.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these successful business leaders, they were hesitant to involve their teenage kids
Oh, why?
because they were worried about being held accountable by their children
Wow.
if they actually put those commitments down on paper.
It's like they didn't want to be bound by their own values.
It's interesting, isn't it?
It is.
How we can be resistant to defining what's important.
Sometimes it's easier to just go with the flow.
Yeah. But the message here is that we have the power to choose a better life,
Right.
to rediscover love,
Mm-hmm.
to make life an adventure. It's about applying that same intentionality to our personal lives.
And he explains that writing a mission statement is more than just a feel-good exercise.
Okay.
It connects our conscious and subconscious mind. He calls it a psychoneuromuscular activity. Basically, physically writing something down helps solidify it in our mind.
So it's like an action step.
It is.
It reinforces those values.
He even shares an example of a woman who would pause at her front door after work and envision the kind of family interaction she wanted before stepping inside. That intentionality
Wow.
is powerful. And then he talks about learning to listen to conscience. He has this simple exercise. Write down 2 things you want to remember or do the next morning.
Okay.
It's a way to train our minds to be more attuned to that inner voice.
And how does that apply to relationships?
Well, he suggests using all of our senses to imagine our ideal life, marriage, family, really creating a vivid picture of that end in mind.
The clearer the vision, the more likely we are to achieve it.
Exactly. But he stresses that it takes quiet time, creating space to truly hear that inner voice, which, he points out, might be different from those inherited beliefs we've carried with us.
So it's about discerning what we truly value.
Yes. He even uses an analogy about cognitive pictures in lectures, how that initial script we hear can really shape our understanding.
It's like that first impression sets the stage.
It does. But the message is that we have the power to change the script. We can create harmony and happiness in our lives.
It's inspiring, isn't it?
It is. He then shifts to when life calls us, using Viktor Frankl's experiences in concentration camps
Oh, wow.
as an example of finding meaning and choice even in the most difficult circumstances.
Frankel's story is just incredibly powerful. He went from asking, why is this happening to me, to what is life asking of me?
That's a huge shift.
It is.
It's about finding agency even in suffering.
And by listening to what life was asking of him, he became more aware of the needs of others, even in that horrific situation.
That's remarkable.
He shared his meager rations with others. It's a testament to the human spirit. And Stephen actually got to visit with Frankl shortly before his death.
Really?
And he was struck by how engaged Frankl still was with life,
Wow.
working on projects, including his autobiography, The Call of Meaning. Originally, was nicht in meinen Büchern steht, Lebenserinnerungen, which means what is not in my books, memoirs.
That's fitting, and that story really illustrates habit too.
How so?
It's about pausing at those critical points, especially when we want to react, and asking, what is life asking of me? What is my partner asking of me? What do my children need? Then listening to that inner voice and acting accordingly.
Living in alignment with those deeper values.
Exactly. Then the book dives into the 4 human endowments and the importance of keeping commitments as the essence of habit 3. Put first things first. It's about making our actions match our values.
Putting those principles into practice.
Right. He explains that our purpose and value system, which we defined in Habit 2, that's our most important decision. It guides everything else. But it takes willpower, discipline to resist those distractions and really focus on what matters.
So it's easy to get sidetracked.
It is.
But we have to stay focused.
And he lists those 4 endowments: self-awareness, conscience, imagination, and independent will. It's the synergy of those 4 that allows us to be the creative force in our own lives.
They all work together.
They do.
And this, he says, is key to prioritizing our family relationships, especially our marriage.
Which is what people often regret neglecting when they look back on their lives.
It's true. We rarely wish we had spent more time at the office.
Right. And those first 3 habits, being proactive, beginning with the end in mind, and putting first things first, they create this inner synergy. They allow us to break free from the past, to forgive ourselves and others.
And he has another powerful quote here. To rebuild broken relationships, we must first explore our own hearts and discover our own responsibility and faults. It's about owning our part in the dynamic.
Taking responsibility.
Exactly.
And he uses the analogy of learning piano to illustrate what he calls practicing freedom.
Okay.
He says it's the difference between just taking lessons and the dedicated practice that leads to, being able to play well.
So knowledge isn't enough. We have to put in the effort.
It's like you can have the sheet music,
Yeah.
but you have to practice to actually make music.
And he applies that to other areas of life, like forgiveness and not taking offense. It's about using those endowments to reinvent our lives.
But it takes practice.
Consistent effort.
Yeah.
It's not a one-time thing.
Yeah. And then he moves on to the root of happiness, talking about service. He shares their family mission statement: we serve God by serving others. And he explains that how people interpret serving God might differ, but the core idea is focusing outward, contributing to something bigger than ourselves.
It's about giving back.
It is. And he emphasizes that service isn't always easy.
Right.
It requires sacrifice. But that's where true joy comes from. Not just pleasure, but deep joy.
It's about putting others first.
Exactly. And seeing the world through their eyes.
It all goes back to that space between stimulus and response. By pausing, using our self-awareness, imagination, conscience, we can choose better responses.
And with practice, that becomes the source of joy in our relationships.
So that wraps up the first part of the book, which is really about personal effectiveness within relationships.
Right.
Now, before we dive into part 2, there's a section called The 7 Costs of Divorce, which draws on Lori Falk's book, Thinking Divorce, Think Again.
That's a powerful title.
It is. It's a moment to really pause and consider the consequences of that decision.
Makes sense.
He lists 7 key costs: depleted assets,
Right.
From legal fees and dividing property,
Right?
a new half-life with changes in living arrangements and finances, the pain and hurt involved for everyone, affected productivity at work,
Oh, yeah.
guilt, the myth of freedom, because there are new complexities that arise, like co-parenting.
It's not just a clean break.
No. And finally, the impact on children and society.
Oh,
He even asks, where have all the parents gone?
that's a big question.
It is. And he shares some research from Falk's book that really caught my attention.
Yeah, what's that?
It indicates that unhappily married people who stay together are just as likely, or even more likely, to find happiness after 5 years compared to those who divorce and remarry.
That's interesting. So staying in an unhappy marriage doesn't doom you to misery.
Right. A lot of people who rated their marriage as very unhappy actually reported being happy 5 years later. And the success rate for those who stayed together was much higher than for those who divorced and remarried.
So there's potential for things to improve within a marriage.
That's the takeaway. And he ends the section with this powerful question from Falk. Is it really worth inflicting that kind of harm on children, family, community? She urges people to really reconsider if there's any doubt.
It's a call to really think about those long-term consequences. Now, moving on to part 2 of the book, it shifts to building a high-performance marriage culture. Practical methods for implementing the 7 habits.
This is where we start to get into the practical side of things.
It is. And to guide us, he brings in his brother, John Covey, and John's wife, Jane,
Okay.
who they describe as close friends who have really made it a point to apply these habits to their own lives.
So they're walking the talk.
They are. And it's interesting to hear John's perspective as Stephen's brother. And Jane also observed how Stephen had a positive influence on John.
So it adds another layer of experience to the conversation.
It does. And this part of the book takes on a Q&A format,
Okay.
really focusing on practical ways to use these habits to improve our relationships.
Great.
And they acknowledge that our listeners are coming from all different situations.
Right. Some might be thinking about marriage, others remarried, and some just looking for more happiness in their current relationships.
Exactly. And they emphasize that these principles are universal. They can work for anyone. They even say that if you consistently practice any one of the habits for 21 days, you'll see a difference.
Oh, wow.
It's encouraging to know that even small efforts can make a difference.
Yeah.
They then introduce the 4 C's of marriage partnership: commitment, character, communication, and companionship. It's a nice framework for understanding what makes a strong relationship.
And how do those connect to the habits?
Well, they explain that habits 1 through 3 build commitment and character.
Okay.
Habits 4 through 6 focus on communication.
Right.
And habit 7 is all about companionship.
So each category has its own set of habits. And that first C, commitment, they describe it as a blank box. What do they mean by that?
It's not something that's just automatically full.
Right.
You have to put things in.
Okay.
Love, giving, service, praise,
That's positive things.
Exactly. You can't take more out than you put in.
That makes sense. And Jane adds that a successful marriage, one that lasts, requires that unwavering commitment and strong character.
And that's where those first 3 habits come in.
Yeah. Building that foundation.
And to illustrate this, they share a story from Mary Pfeiffer's book, Shelter from the Storm. It's about a couple hiking near a waterfall, and the wife falls in.
Oh, no.
It's a really powerful story. The husband, he jumps in to save her, even though it's dangerous.
Wow.
He's trying everything he can to get her out.
It shows how much he loves her.
It really does. And then the rope they're using breaks.
Oh, gosh.
They're both stuck in the water above the falls. But what's amazing is how the wife stays calm. She keeps encouraging him. He's losing strength, it's freezing cold, but she's talking to him, keeping him conscious.
Wow, that's incredible.
It's amazing. They're in the water for 40 minutes.
Oh, my God.
Before the park rangers can reach them. And the rangers tell their kids that their dad's a hero.
Oh.
It's such a moving story.
It really is.
Yeah.
It shows what true commitment looks like, even in the face of danger.
Being there for each other no matter what.
And, it makes those everyday arguments seem so small.
It does put things in perspective.
Yeah.
And the book offers this message of hope. That even though we're all imperfect, if we're willing to fight for each other, for our marriage, we can overcome those challenges.
Encouraging.
It is. And John emphasizes that to use these 7 habits effectively, it takes a shifting perspective, a renewed commitment.
And it starts with ourselves.
Exactly. We can't expect the relationship to change if we're not willing to change ourselves. And that brings them to the concept of creating a high-performance marriage culture, which, they explain, is formed by the habits of both partners.
So it's a shared effort.
It is. And they have this interesting contrast between what they call a first marriage culture and a second marriage culture.
Oh, I'm curious to hear about that.
So the first marriage culture is more passive, blaming. There's no clear direction. It's competitive. People are focused on their own needs. They point out weaknesses.
It sounds like a recipe for conflict.
It does. Whereas the second marriage culture is proactive, calm, purposeful.
Okay.
Couples prioritize time together. They have a win-win mindset.
Right.
They listen empathetically. They focus on strengths. They try to create a balanced life.
So it's a complete shift in perspective.
It really is. It's the difference between reacting to problems and proactively creating a better dynamic.
And they point out that these principles are timeless. They apply to all relationships, regardless of culture.
They're universal truths.
Exactly. And then they list the 7 habits again, this time highlighting the core principles behind each one. So habit 1, be proactive, is about choice, responsibility, initiative. Habit 2, begin with the end in mind, is about vision, purpose, commitment, meaning.
Makes sense.
Habit 3, put first things first, is about focus, priorities, discipline, integrity,
I like how they break it down like that.
and so on. Each habit has its own set of principles that guide our actions.
It's a roadmap. So let's delve into habit 1, be proactive.
Yes, let's.
It's about choosing our responses rather than just reacting to things.
Being intentional.
Exactly. And Jane uses a great analogy to illustrate this.
Okay.
She talks about shaking a soda bottle versus shaking a water bottle.
Oh, okay.
The soda bottle represents a reactive person. When you shake it up, it explodes. But the water bottle, which represents a proactive person, stays calm.
I get it.
So it's about choosing how we respond to pressure.
Reactive people just, like, burst.
Yeah, without thinking. But proactive people pause.
Right.
They consider their values, and they choose their response based on those values.
So it's not about